All right, thanks, Shannon. And hope everybody was able to take a little bit of a stretch break, grab a lunch, get up and enjoy the fresh air and beautiful weather outside a little bit potentially. Please go ahead and continue to post questions or comments in the chat as we have them. We are having a bit of a conversation in the chat about practice lifespans and irrigation pipelines, so we'll revisit that here in a little bit. But we'll go ahead and keep going with the agenda. And as I mentioned before lunch, our next speaker is Amanda Couts, who's going to talk about crop rotations. Amanda, are you ready?
I'm ready. Let me see if I can get this shared. And move the little Teams window. All right, can you guys see my presentation?
Looks great.
Okay. So we're going to go into conservation crop rotation, which is practice 328. And y'all might be more familiar with it on a large farm. On large farms, we typically use it to add a crop to the rotation, like going from a corn bean rotation to a corn bean wheat rotation. And many times the resource concerns that we're targeting there are the soil health resource concerns and the erosion resource concerns. But as you can see on that list there, there's lots of other ones we can focus on as well. And in the small farm scenario, we are most likely going to be focusing on reducing plant pest pressures and providing food and cover habitat for wildlife, including pollinator, forage, and nesting. Small farms, it's going to look a little different. They can add a new crop to the rotation, but it could be changing a current crop rotation to change length of time between different crops, but still keeping the same number of species. So it's a little bit different than what you may be used to. And on small farms, many times there are crop areas in production that may have different rotations. So instead of, thinking about a large ag field where you might have 100 acres under the same crop rotation, you may have, an acre farm on the small farm, but there may be several different beds with several different rotations that you will need to keep track of. So that's just kind of food for thought there. And you may be thinking, why not, the soil health or the erosion resource concern purposes for the small farms? And basically it's because these purposes are going to require numbers from Russell 2, and we don't have the Russell 2 information to be able to input the crop rotations for these types of farms accurately right now, because it's hard to equate the large agricultural tools that are normally in Russell 2 to the small farm tools that we would be seeing on a small farm. And you've got some examples there on the right. So at this time, when you're working on programs, we're saying not to pick these resource concern purposes as your main purpose for the crop rotation, just because we don't have the data to be able to get the numbers to back it up. And obviously, it's still good to advise producers to use the rotations that are going to serve that purpose for soil health. We always want to advocate for that. We just don't have the info to implement it for financial assistance this fiscal year. We are hoping to be able to do that in the future, but as of right now, Russell 2 just isn't cooperating with us. So some reminders if you want to provide information for some technical assistance, because this is something that your producers are interested in. There is the Agronomy Tech Note Crop Rotations for Soil Quality and Soil Health, and it's going to talk about what your high residue crops are, which in a vegetable or specialty crop rotations, you can see listed there, most of our options are going to be cover crops or some kind of corn, either sweet corn or popcorn. And again, it's always a good practice to maintain residue cover, reduce disturbance, diversify crop rotations, even without program dollars. So if someone's looking for this information, we can offer them that through this tech note. So for the 328, for the purposes that we are looking at, there's some general criteria that can be applicable to both purposes. So crops are going to be grown in the planned sequence, and it's going to include a minimum of 2 crops. And in this practice, cover crop is going to count as a crop for the purpose of the rotation. So if you have a cash crop and a cover crop, that is your 2 crops. And they need to plan suitable crop substitutions because we all know things can change, and we need to make sure that there's backup plan that'll still fit the guidance for the crop rotation. And then obviously no known invasive species are going to be used. Sometimes in some of these scenarios, we get some kind of off the wall crops or off the wall cover crops people are going to want to use just because it's a different scenario. And we need to be making sure that we're not introducing something that can become an issue later. So just keep an eye on that. And another thing to think about as you're looking at this, do you want to do technical assistance versus putting them in a program? At this point, if you've got somebody signed up, obviously you've decided they were going to go into a program, but for some future thoughts there, this is a practice you're going to need lots of information. It can get complicated pretty quickly, and the producer is going to have to be very heavily involved. So these are some questions to think about. What are you planting and where? Why are you interested in the crop rotation? Are you willing to alter your current rotation? All of these are things you and the producer are going to have to discuss and decide, because a lot of these crops are very market dependent, which may mean that they want to grow, tomatoes for a market that they've got there and do that all the time. And then they won't be able to do a rotation that we're going to expect of them, and they aren't willing to alter that because the market, that's what their market is. It may not be a good fit for them. So just keep that kind of stuff in mind. It's a very important conservation practice in general, but it may not be for every producer through our programs to allow them some flexibility for the different business decisions that they need to make. And some things you can ask them to think about to bring to you before that meeting. Have them think about their current crop rotation and management. What pest or disease problems do they have? Are they seeing an issue with a certain spot, like a field or a high tunnel? And are there some priority crops where they can make a change? So is there a part of the farm that they're willing to alter a crop rotation, and a part of the farm they may not be willing to alter a crop rotation? And this is going to complement those questions you're going to ask them later in that conversation or that field visit. So hopefully everybody will be on the same page. So if we are doing programs, we're thinking that equip might be the best scenario here if growers are managing rotations via kind of a more simplified crop block. So they've got larger areas that are under the same crop rotation and a simplified crop rotation where it has less crops per year. High tunnels and fields that are currently rotated with a 1-year wait time that might still have presenting resource concerns, that if you fine tune the crop rotation, it might help them, address those resource concerns. And if there's clear resource concerns present on a farm that's not doing crop rotation, like that example I was talking about with, constant tomatoes, because that's their market, and they're willing to change that, that might be an option as well. And remember, this doesn't have to be implemented on the whole farm. They can take part of their farm and implement this crop rotation and manage the other however they wish. And then again, we're going to have to fill out a IR, or they're going to have to provide us their crop rotation in another form. It can be a spreadsheet, hand-drawn plan, whatever, they use. And you as a conservation planner can help them figure out if this is going to fit the 328 as you're going through and making the plan. However, the crop rotation is going to be something they are going to have to figure out, because a lot of these are business decisions. So you can help them make sure it fits 328, but this isn't an IR you're going to be able to sit down and fill out by yourself without help from the producer. So now let's go into each of the purposes. So the purpose, reducing plant pest pressure, we need to look at the functional rotating crops from different functional groups, which we interpreted this as crop families, to suppress weeds, insects, and pathogens that may be showing up on the farm. So the criteria for this is crops within the same crop family may not be grown in the same location within successive years. There's a minimum of a 1-year wait time between crop families. And this is because doing that helps break pest and disease cycles, which is what we're trying to do here. And there are some exceptions that may apply according to the industry standard or guidance from Purdue. And some of those things may have to do with some cover crops in rotation that may be within the same crop family, or if there is a known pest or disease problem present that we're going to have to address, we may have to go more than 1 year or change some things. So if you have a situation that you think you may have an exception, contact the state office and we'll help you figure that out and see if the rotation that's being applied for is going to work. And just a reminder, in 201, we did the plant families and we had all of our veggies and we had to get in our groups. So here's a nice reminder of our plant families. For example, the Solanaceae family or the nightshade family, tomatoes, chilies, bell peppers, eggplants, and potatoes are all in that family. So you wouldn't be able to grow any of these in the same place without a 1-year wait time between them. And then I'm gonna let Ellie go over this crop rotation survey that she's got. So I'm gonna control the slides and she's gonna walk you guys through it. And there's a QR link or a link there to pull up that survey.
We'll go ahead and give you 3 minutes to answer the questions. There are only 5 of them. And we'll start the clock now. So at 2:24, we'll regroup. Sorry, 12:24. All right, let's progress to the first couple of questions. So on number 1, let me just see the responses. Hold on a second. Number 1, year 1 tomatoes, then moving to year 2 cucumbers. Would this rotation fulfill the 1-year wait time required before planting crops in the same family again? And let's see, we have 68% of people said yes, which is the correct answer. And then 33% of people said no. So it is yes. It would fulfill the 1-year wait time required before planting crops in the same family again, because tomatoes are in the Solanaceae family, cucumbers are cucurbits, and so we don't have a conflict between those 2 years of rotation. So we do have a wait time of 1 year. Then number 2. Oh, there is I see an issue with my slides. I'm so sorry. So number 2 on your quiz was actually cabbage and then collards. And so pay attention to the actual quiz. Would this fulfill the rotation? We have 25% of people said yes, and 75% of people said no. Those 75% of people are correct. So cabbage and collards are both in the brassica family, so it would not fulfill the 1-year wait time required. And a note, a lot of these touch on both solanaceous and brassica families because there are typically a lot of disease and pathogen carryover between those 2 crop families. So very important to have that at least 1-year wait time before those those crop families. All right, number 3. Back on track. So year 1, sunflowers, year 2, lettuce. We have 33% answered correctly. So this would not fulfill the rotation. A lot of you said yes. We stumped you all. Both sunflowers and lettuce are in the Asteraceae family, and so it would not fulfill the wait time. Question 4. I'm so sorry. I got these slides numbering system all screwed up, so I apologize for that. But the content is correct. So year 1, cabbage, going to tomatoes. So you have 2 different crops that year, then going to a 3rd crop of oats cover crop. And then for the next year, we go from collards to peppers. So would this rotation fulfill the 1-year wait time required before planting crops in the same family again? We had 55% of people said yes, 45% of people said no, so kind of an even split. The answer is no, and it's kind of a double no, double negative for this one. So you have cabbage and collards, which we knew from the previous example was a no. And then tomatoes and peppers, those are both solanaceous crops. So there are 2 things in that example rotation that would need to change in order to fulfill that 1-year wait requirement. And having that oats cover crop in there, that's great. That's awesome. That's soil building. That's also helping to break pest and disease cycles, but it's not quite enough to hit that minimum requirement. And then last question, number 5. Oh man, I really screwed up my slides. We have peppers to radish cover crop, and then year 2 collards. So would this fulfill? We have 65% of people said yes, 35% of people said no. So you're actually swapped on that one. It's kind of a tricky one because peppers and collards, the primary harvested crop, those are in different families. So you have the solanaceous or nightshade, and then you have brassica with the collards. However, what's kicking this out is because of the requirement or consideration that a cover crop will be considered a crop for the purpose of the rotation. So the radish cover crop, that is a brassica, and then you're going to collards, which is also brassica. So that back-to-back brassica to brassica is what is making this a no for the purpose of rotation. And so stumped quite a few people, which I guess is just emphasizing the importance of the tool and hopefully the utility of the tool, which we'll introduce a little bit more later. And, you know, there's a lot of crops out there and a lot of crops that small growers are planting. So the tool will have the crop and the crop family listed so you can have an easy reference sheet. And then the tool has embedded that whether the rotation meets the standard. So we'll get into that more later. But something that is just a really good note to self to when working with growers is to thinking about their crop rotation in terms of what families they're planting back to back, because that is so important for pest and pest, pathogen, and disease cycles. All right, back to you, Kara. Amanda.
Thanks, Ellie. You only had 2 slides swapped. You're good. Okay. So we were talking about those exceptions right before we did that little exercise. So just to expand on that really quickly, some of the things you may want to float up to us to see if we can approve them or not, or if the producer plans to plant a cover crop in the same family 2 years in a row. For example, oats and oats within 2 years. Oats and cereal rye, or oats and sorghum Sudan grass, because all of those are grasses. And then the other thing, as Ellie covered in that example there, if the producer plans to plant a cover crop in the same family as the previous crop or the following crop. So there it was brassicas. Here it is sorghum Sudan grass to sweet corn would both be grasses, and crimson clover to peas would both be legumes. So if you've got any of those scenarios when you guys get into planning this and you need some help taking a look at it, contact us at the state office and we can walk you through it and do some double checks. And I'm going to run you real quick through how we're going to do that. You're not going to have to do it yourself, but I wanted you to have a little bit of background to know like what sources we're using. One of these things we're going to use is the SARE crop rotation on organic farms. And they've got a nice table in here that you can see the preceding crop and the following crops. And we're going to use that for the purposes of checking this. We're going to look at disease problems, weed problems, insect problems, and then it will also tell you if crops are the same, as in the case of this example that we're going to use. So if we have radishes and then we were wanting to use a radish cover crop, or we had radishes as a cover crop and then we wanted to plant a brassica after it, you can see in that box there's a lot of disease issues, as well as radishes, and radishes are the same crop. So that's one of the double checks we're going to be using. The other thing is going to be if there's a known disease issue present. It often occurs in high tunnel situations with like back-to-back crops like tomatoes continuously, or tomatoes to peppers and back to tomatoes. If your grower has issues and they don't know what that issue is, you can have them contact the Purdue Pest and Disease Lab for analysis, and they can send some samples in and get some help figuring out what that is. But again, that kind of scenario, contact the state office. We'll help you through and take a look. And the guide we're going to be using for that is the Midwest Vegetable Production Guide that Purdue is a part of putting together. They've got a nice chart that's going to show the crop and the rotation. And you can see I've highlighted some here. There's one that needs 3 years, one that rotation isn't effective at all. So we would need to look at addressing that some other way. And then one that has a rotation of 5 to 7 years. So as you can see, it'll really vary. And each field office should have a hard copy of this SARE guide here that we've been referencing. If you don't, again, contact Ellie and she can get you with that. And it also has a nice guide on what can be managed with crop rotation with diseases as well, if you need that for any technical assistance. And then Ellie, are you going to take this slide?
Yes, let me just share my screen here in a second. Actually, if you can keep it up for a second. So we are, like Amanda said, in the process of building in those references that she mentioned into our tools so that you would have automatic checks for those more complicated situations. Right now, contact state office and we'll work you through those, and we'll provide follow-up training once we do have those built in.
All right. Thank you for that. So that'll be really nice once it's going.
Sorry, I think, yeah, just go ahead and take the next purpose, and then I'll show the tool at the end.
Okay, sounds good. So the next purpose is going to be providing food and cover habitat for wildlife. So we're going to target a wildlife species and or using cover crops to benefit pollinators. There's a couple of tech notes that are mentioned in the practice standard that are pretty useful. Biology Technote 4, which is the Upland Wildlife Habitat Management, has this nice table in it to see the life history needs of targeted species. So you can see pollinators, monarchs, native bees, other pollinators. If you're trying to attract birds for any reason, songbirds for any reason, that's in there as well. So you can see how to kind of tailor your crop rotation plan to get them what they need there. And then there's also Tech Note 5, which is using cover crops to benefit pollinators. Has a great table that shows some ratings on cover crops with for pollinators, as well as specific additional considerations to think about, like insecticide use in areas you're trying to attract pollinators for, or that type of thing that may apply depending on, you know, what the farm specifically uses. And just some really quick pictures to show what we're talking about there. Here's some cover crops that you may use to attract pollinators. We got some bees on some crimson clover. There's a moth on the sunflower there. And then there's a nice stand of buckwheat there that some bees are buzzing around. So definitely pollinators using the cover crops. And then beneficial insects are something else to think about. So ladybugs, or on the right, that hornworm on the tomato plant has had a parasitic wasp lay eggs on it. So that is actually going to take care of that issue. So supporting that beneficial wasp that'll take care of that pest issue is another thing that we definitely want to think about.
So right now, the tool that we have is primarily used for the purpose of, if you have selected the plant pest pressures tool, use this new Excel tool. If you've selected the plant, the habitat purpose, then for now, just go ahead and keep using the existing IR for 328. Next. So if you remember from mulching, going back to the same example, for this, for the use of the tool, we're going to say that the grower wants to focus on crop rotation within the high tunnel and also within those field crops, the 2 blocks of growing beds outside. Next. So within the high tunnel refresher, all of the beds are managed with the same rotation. So planting the same crop in the entire high tunnel year after year. If that grower wanted to split the high tunnel and manage part of the bed differently, then you would need to have a different location ID for each half of those growing beds, let's say. And then in the field, we still have those 2 blocks, block A and block B, that are managed according to the same rotation for those grouping of beds. Next. So for the high tunnel, again, refresher, important to have the location ID unique for each area. And once you've entered that information on the mulching calculator, or if you start with the cover crop or the crop rotation calculator, you should be able to easily copy and paste and make sure that you're using the same information, same square foot areas for each. Next. And digging in more to the high tunnel, I'll show you the Excel usable tool here in a second, but want to really walk through each of these independently. So first off, we have the whole high tunnel. That 1125 square feet comes from the location ID total area that auto populates. And then on the left-hand column, you see a row for each year. So for the high tunnel, for the purpose of this example, we're saying that they only want to do a 3-year planned rotation. So 2023, 24, and 25. And there are places for up to 5 crops in the rotation. For that year, you can add more rows if you want, but we thought maximum, most growers are doing 5 crops. You know, again, could be more, could be less. So for this example, there's only going to be 2 crops in that first year, 3 crops in that second year, and then back to 2 crops in that third year. And the most important part of this tool is that it will have an easy color code green or red if that rotation meets the standard. And so what the tool is doing is it's looking both in the previous year and then also the following year to see if there are crops in the same families or different families. So if it's in the, let's say for 2024, you would look in 2023 and then 2025 to see, do all crops meet that 1 year wait between crop families? And then just a quick note to remember that interaction between other practices. So for mulching in the high tunnel, there's straw in that first year. After the lettuce comes out and they plant tomatoes, and then no straw in the high tunnel for that second year because they're planting everything by seed. But then they do want to mulch up their peppers and kale after that 1 year wait. So there's straw again. I know I'm adding complexity there. The tool doesn't take account both of those complexities, but it's so important when gathering producer information to think about, okay, how are they managing residue? How are they managing those flips between different crops? Next. And then we'll look at the two different areas in the field. For block A, 1,250 square feet, that's going to be planned for crop rotation. That excludes walkways automatically, which is awesome. And we're going to say that for the first year, they are only planting one crop, planting peppers. And then more complexity in the second year, they want to do lettuce in the spring, summer squash over the summer, go to a cover crop mix of oats and peas. Right now, those are just entered as independent lines for a mix, just to make sure that those families don't conflict. With any other years, we are going to build into the ability to look at mixes as a, as a full mix together. Next. And then for block B, we're going to have 3 different crops in that first year: spinach, potatoes, then collards, and then go to cucumbers and lettuce the next year. You can see that all of these meet the standard and planned it accordingly. And for the field, they only want to do a 2-year planned rotation. Let's say they can only think that far out and they don't want to be locked into a contract for that 3rd year in the field. That's totally fine. You can plan for the high tunnel separately than the field. And back to what Amanda said, you don't even have to consider or plan the practice on the entire field. If there is an area that they know that they can use this practice according to those requirements, then rock on. All right, next. All right. Actually, this is where, can I show the tool really fast?
That's what I was just going to ask. Go.
Awesome. I just want to show what you'll get when you have a rotation that does not meet. So let's say I wanted to plan in the high tunnel, I wanted to do, instead of cucumbers, I wanted to do peppers. Go to this drop-down list. There's flowers, there's crops, and then there's cover crops, all alphabetical by grouping. So let's say this was peppers. It is a long list that automatically says no, it would not meet because of the nightshade in the previous year. Similar, let's say I wanted to do radish cover crop here. It's going to say no for the following 2025 because of 2 reasons. Because I previously planted peppers and then also had the radish cover crop. So really great to be able to take into account all years planned and those interactions. And then here's where the reference information is for your crops, cover crops, and flowers. And you can add more rows here. Let's say if there is a crop that they're planting, just go ahead and add it, look up the crop family, and it should pull over to the previous tab. And then a note on crop family names. There's a lot of different ways to refer to crop families. You might hear a grower say solanaceous, whereas this tool says nightshade. You might hear brassica a lot, and I typically talk about brassicas. However, for the purpose of this tool, we used mustard, and that is because of the where we're going with this is to build in the crop sequence problems and opportunities, really long matrix to cross-reference any other possible disease interactions between specific crop rotations. So we want to be able to use similar language across multiple reference information. This is pulled over right now, so at least you don't have to go to cross-reference a PDF. Right now, it's not automatically building in, but still a useful reference. And then any additional notes from that cross-reference are listed on the second page. And then from Midwest Veg Production Guide, as Amanda was saying, there are crops that need a longer rotation between the crop family if it is already present on farm. And you might have growers that preventatively want to have that longer rotation built in if possible to make sure that it's not present in future years. That's all I wanted to show. Thank you. Back to you, Amanda.
Okay, last little bit. So you planned it. Now, how do you check it? So to certify this, in the practice user guide, it says you need to do field verification. So you're going to ask the producer for the crop rotation records, and you can use the IR if there haven't been any changes. But if there's been changes, you want to make sure that they have been documented and they do fit the crop rotation standard. You're going to verify the contracted amount is under production, and you're going to take a few pictures and make an assistance note. So you need to include who, what, when, where, why, just like we do on all of them. And it's especially important to keep track of that because assistance notes are going to be your friend, because you're basically getting a snapshot in time when you do this. You may, if they have multiple crops per year, your assistance notes plus your IR are going to be your documentation, because obviously you're probably not going to see every crop that they have out there. And some of this may move around the PLU a little bit based on different factors on the farm, but you want to make sure that the correct amount is under production and that it has not been moved outside the contracted area in order to keep your contract in compliance. And then we've just got a list of resources here. Some of these are the same as 201. Some of them are the things we've referenced here, but good resources for you to be able to go back and reference if you have extra questions or want to do more research on your own. And that is all we've got.
Well, I appreciate both of you kind of tag teaming this topic. It's a big one, and like you mentioned, it's variable, quite a bit more variable than we might think of on a more traditional farm. So lots of good information, and I'll kind of make a call here to see if there's any questions that folks want to ask regarding crop rotations for Amanda or Ellie. And while you think about that, again, type it in the chat or raise your hand. Just want to say thanks to the both of you again about having folks reach out to the state office with some of these questions and references, because again, it just provides a good opportunity for that exchange of information back to them, as well as for you guys to kind of know what folks are running into in the field. So great idea. Not seeing any additional questions in the chat, so I will go ahead and move on to our next topic. We have one more topic we're going to discuss before we take another break. So before break, we'll go ahead and switch over to Dan Shaver, who's going to talk trees and shrubs. Dan?
Thanks, Jennifer. Good afternoon, everybody. I am going to go through some of our tree planting and shrub planting practices that we can utilize on our urban areas and small farms. To start off with, I just want to give you or make a quick plug for the USDA National Agroforestry Center. If you have not been to this website, it's worth going in and spending a few minutes. They've updated the site. There's a lot of good handouts and informational pages, good resources, and most of our agroforestry practices, of course, scale down nicely for our small farms and urban areas. Let's see, so we'll jump right in with 612 tree and shrub establishment. With our small farms and urban areas, we do have a practice that is for small acreages, less than 1 acre. You can see at the top of the screen, the rate for this practice this year is $13.64 per tree, and it includes all kinds of planting stock. So producers can choose to use bare root seedlings or container trees, whatever works for their situation and the resource concerns they're trying to address. We do want to consider tree protection when we're working on small farms and urban areas. With our large-scale tree plantings, we have problems with deer damage, especially. When you have a large tree plantation, sometimes you can overwhelm that deer herd by planting a lot of trees and seedlings, and a lot of vegetation comes in. In our urban areas, we still have problems with deer as well as with rodents, and so using some sort of tree protection is advised. We recommend with trees and shrubs, or at least with trees, 52-inch tall tree shelters. You know, in some cases, if you know your concern is rabbits, you may be able to get by with a smaller tree shelter. We can also plant our trees in rows, blocks, or clumps. And again, we're kind of conditioned to think about planting in rows with our large-scale tree planting. But in these small farms and urban areas, we can plant in blocks or clumps of trees. And our species requirements, it's the same with our large fields that we're going to plant. We want to look at the conservation practice standard to make sure we are complying with that. There's also a nice list in the forestry technical note number 2 that can be found on the FOTG. Web Soil Survey has a nice report where you can find trees and shrubs suitable for 612. And then we also have the INNRCS general seeding calculator that you can utilize if you want to. When it comes to Web Soil Survey, I think it's actually a really nice tool to utilize for developing your tree planting plans. And a lot of us are familiar with Web Soil Survey, but just to give you a quick run through, several of our standards reference the forest productivity report in Web Soil Survey. In order to find that, you are going to go into Web Soil Survey and define your area of interest. Once you do that, you can click on the Soil Data Explorer tab. Then over on the right, click on Soil Reports. A whole series of reports pop up, and you can click on Vegetative Productivity, and then Forest Land Productivity, and then finally this View Soil Report. Once you do that, it will pull up this handy dandy little table here that shows common trees that are suitable. It'll give you their site index. And you can see on this example, this is a small urban area. They're just wanting to plant a few trees, and the tree list is not very robust. It just says tulip tree and white oak. And my producer wants to plant a little grove of persimmon with 3 trees. This doesn't mean I cannot plant persimmon. I just need to do a little more research. So we have other options. We could check out the forestry technical note number 2, and we go in here, and it has a whole table with a list of trees that are suitable to be planted. And lo and behold, persimmon is here. And when we look across this row, it is suitable on moderately well-drained and well-drained soils. And that is compatible with what we had on Web Soil Survey for that area. And so persimmon is a fine choice for our producer. So we know what they want. We know the trees are suitable. Now we need a tree planting plan. And with 612, we have an IR, an implementation requirement on the FOTG. It works well for large scale tree plantations. It works well for a few trees in a yard. You can see what is required here on the left. We need to know the species, potential substitute species, the site conditions before planting, how we're going to prepare that site, the planting method, tree protection, post-planting maintenance, and then a map of the tree planting area. It seems like a lot, but it's really not too difficult to fill out. And hopefully you can see the IR on the right. I went ahead and used my name here, so we're not giving away any personal information that's privileged in any way. But you can see I went through and filled this out. It's a very small tree planting. I got the soils listed, the drainage class, how they're going to plant them, the spacing. You know, in this case, they just want to plant a couple trees. So plants per acre isn't really a metric that helps me very much. So I just typed in 3 individual trees. Fairly simple. Listed them down here within the species code, or with the species and the number. And in this case, I didn't choose any substitute species. I could have, but my producer really wants to plant persimmon. So in this case, I'm not worried about the nursery running out of persimmon and not being able to plant several acres of persimmon trees. I'm just looking for 3 persimmons, so they can find these wherever they want to, at their local nursery, garden center, big box store, whatever they want to do. They should be able to find persimmon, so I'm not too worried about substitutes. I went ahead and listed the site conditions before planting, how they're going to plant them. I did include tree protection, and then with post-planting maintenance, I included keeping a weed-free zone around that tree. Again, maybe like we heard from Ellie, mulching's an option, and we could then include some notes down here under other for mulching, the type of mulching that would be required, and we can use that as part of our planning process. Of course, down here in additional information, it's nice to put in a little bit of a description about what is going to happen on this tree planting. And then, of course, we want a map, hopefully a little bigger map than this. But again, we're really just trying to locate where those trees are going to be planted on the property. So that's pretty simple. That doesn't take much time to fill out that tree planting IR. And I have a few questions for you. So we'll take a minute or two here in the chat. We'll kind of go through these questions. So the first question I'd like to get some responses from is, do we need a forest management plan for 612 tree planting? Go ahead and type yes or no in the chat to that question. Seeing some no's pop up right off the bat. No one wants to volunteer a yes. I like it. That's good. Yeah, the answer for this is no. For 612 tree planting, we do not need a tree or a forest management plan. So to go along with that real quick, yes or no in the chat, do we need a forester for this IR? To complete this IR on this small farm or urban area, do we need to utilize a forester? Yes or no? Seeing a nope, some no's. I saw a yes pop up in there. Couple more no's. Again, the answer on this one, we have too many foresters. Everybody wants to use a forester. They're fun people, but in this case, we do not have to use a forester for our tree planting plan. And the final question, does the certified planner have approval to develop the 612 IR for this scenario? Yes or no? Go ahead and type it in the chat if you think a certified planner has approval to develop this IR. Seeing a yes pop up real quick. More yeses. All right, we're getting lots of yeses to that question, and that is the correct answer, is that our planners can develop this IR if they want to. We utilize our forestry partners a lot on our large scale tree plantations. If you call your local forester to develop an IR for the small farm and urban areas, they're probably going to decline that request. It's not really what they do. It's not really where they focus their time. And so this is something that as an employee, you can develop this for the property you're working on, or one of our partners that we work with may be able to fill out an IR or come up with the planting request and provide that to you. Great job on answering the questions. One other thing I want to point out with our urban tree planting and our small farm tree planting, when we plant out in fields, we are aware of concerns, hazards that may exist, road rights of way, power lines, gas lines. Those things out in our large rural areas are issues, but they're usually fairly easy to identify. When we get into our urban setting, there are a lot more hazards that we need to be aware of. And urban forestry for years has promoted right tree in the right place. And we want to do the same thing with our producers. We want to make sure that we're planting an appropriately sized tree in the area so that we're not planting something too big, something that's going to interfere with whether it's septic or drainage tiles, irrigation systems, power lines, road rights of way, internet boxes, electrical boxes on the corner of the street, whatever it is. We need to just be more aware of that in the small farm and urban setting and make sure we're not going to compromise any of those, that infrastructure with our trees, with the height or with the roots of those trees. All right, we'll go ahead and jump on to the next tree planting related practice. This is alley cropping. We touched on this briefly earlier in the year when we were kind of rolling out some of our practices. Alley cropping, I like this diagram at the top of the page. It really shows what they're talking about from an alley cropping system and defines which parts of that system are what. So you can see here the alleys are the actual crop that are grown in between rows of trees or shrubs. And that's why they call it alley cropping, because we are cropping in that alley between those two rows of trees and shrubs. When you're planting alley cropping, you need to know the width of that alley. You need to know the length of the tree rows, as well as the spacing within that tree row. This looks great when you look at this picture. In reality, a lot of times in our small farm and urban areas, this may be what we're doing when it comes to alley cropping. Somebody may have a garden or a cropped area and they want to add a row of trees or shrubs to it. And it may not be this repeated series of tree rows and alleys and tree rows and alleys. It may just be one block like this. And that's okay. That works with this practice. You can see at the bottom of the screen, it is the payment is for each. So it's for paying for each tree or shrub that is planted within that tree row. And this needs to be planted between, within, or among row crops. And there's multiple benefits with alley cropping: wildlife, increasing crop diversity, controlling erosion, a lot of different things that benefit from using alley cropping. We do have an implementation requirement for alley cropping. You can see here it's still called a job sheet. We need to get this one updated to an implementation requirement. Pretty similar to our tree planting IR, with site preparation, the location and layout, the species to be used, the type of stock you'll be planting, the distance between plants within the row, and then the distance between those rows of trees and shrubs. And the IR itself is laid out fairly well. That allows you to put in the different tree rows, the kind of stock, the distance between them, and it's a fairly simple implementation requirement to fill out. If you have any questions on this or you're not familiar with alley cropping, don't hesitate to reach out to someone a little bit higher up the chain of command, or if you need to, you can elevate it to me at some point in time and we can work through getting this IR completed. The big thing to stress with alley cropping is that it is required to be planted on cropland or hayland PLUs. And so we have gone through the guidance in our planning documents. We issued a bulletin here earlier this year that looked at how we classify our small farm and urban areas as cropland and other PLUs. So just be mindful of that when you're planning alley cropping, that this does need to be utilized on cropland or hayland. We want to use native plant species whenever possible. We've heard that a few times today. No known invasive species. And the one thing that's nice about alley cropping is it is an opportunity here. We can utilize some fruit trees and shrubs that would not necessarily be eligible with 612. If somebody wanted to go in and plant in some pear trees or some other fruit trees within their garden area using alley cropping, that is an option with alley cropping, where with 612, we're not really in the business of creating an orchard or planting those non-native fruit trees. I'm going to switch gears to windbreak and shelter belt real quick. Go through that. Again, we do have a nice small acreage scenario for windbreaks and shelter belts. The payment is per foot, and we pay on the total amount planned, the total linear footage of windbreak that is planned. We do have a cap within windbreak, within the windbreak standard, within our practice user guide of 200 linear feet. That kind of helps us differentiate between the small farm scenario and our traditional scenario. And you can see the reasons for utilizing windbreaks here. These all apply just like they do on our larger windbreaks. It's shelter from wind and snow, excessive heat, protect animals, structures, and humans. And so within our small farm and urban settings, we may get a few more requests to put windbreaks either closer to structures or adjacent to livestock, maybe around beehives or something like that. There's a lot of opportunity to utilize windbreaks with trees and shrubs. Again, with this, we want to use native species whenever possible. And if you go into the practice standard for windbreak and shelter belt, it'll give you some references just like 612 does to find out which species are suitable. And I'm going to reference the web soil survey again. I think we have a really great tool in web soil survey when it comes to our windbreaks. It's very similar to the forest productivity report we did. You define your area of interest. You can see I defined a little area for a windbreak here. You go into Soil Data Explorer, then into Soil Reports, back down into Vegetative Productivity on the left-hand side of the screen, and you can actually open up, there's a little drop-down menu here for environmental plantings and windbreaks, and we actually have our own Indiana-specific recommendations here. When you click to view this report, it pops up a very nice summary of species that'll suitable for windbreaks within that soil type. And it's very nice that it breaks it out by height of the species that you're planning to use for that windbreak. So in some of our small farm and urban settings, we may be doing a more dense windbreak of shorter shrubs. And this gives us different species all the way up to the greater than 35 feet tall. So a really nice tool, great information, and something that is, once you start using it, it's very easy to use and find the information. We do have a job sheet or an implementation requirement for windbreaks. Again, very similar to that 612 tree planting IR. It does allow you to plan the different rows of the windbreak if you're going to have multiple rows within your windbreak, and it allows you to plan the within row and the between the row spacing for each row. So very nice, easy to use. We're going to hit on the before planting, the planting method, and then the post-planting maintenance as well. Just to give you an example of a small farm scenario that we've utilized here in Indiana already. This is a little windbreak that was planned on a cut flower operation here in Indiana. They have flower beds here, and it doesn't show up on the photo, but they actually had flower beds put in this area, and they wanted a bit of a windbreak between this large open field coming into their farm to try to protect their cut flowers from that wind, as well as any potential herbicide drift or anything else that might be coming off of this ag field. The small farm scenario works fairly well in this case. You will see the practice for windbreaks. It says the small acreage scenario is one row only. Again, that is the practice name. We're not necessarily saying you can only have a one row windbreak using this small farm scenario, but you just can't exceed that 200 linear feet, or that's the cap that we're going to pay for. So if you need to do that in 2 rows, each row of this windbreak is going to be utilized to come up with that total amount of footage for the windbreak. And so we don't want to exceed that 200 feet, or we'll exceed the cap, the payment cap. In this case, you can see they had a little bit larger area that warranted 2 rows of shrubs. And down here, as the distance between the property line and their garden beds got smaller, we just went with a single row of shrubs. From a planting standpoint, if they're going to plant all of this in the same year, you can have the total footage tied to all 3 of these lines of windbreak. And that is the extent you would plan for. And then, of course, we have a nice map here to indicate where the actual location is and where we're going to plant those trees and shrubs. So that is windbreaks. And then the last one I wanted to touch on was hedgerows. How hedgerows and our windbreak scenario, they can be very similar. There are some differences. We don't do a lot of hedgerow planting, and we don't have a specific small farm or urban scenario for hedgerows, but it is something that our producers may be interested in. And if they are, we still have, like I said, the traditional scenario, and this is for dense vegetation in a linear design, multiple benefits again, similar to our windbreaks with habitat, pollen production, could be a cover or a screen, a barrier, a living fence, division between, different garden plots, and we can utilize the trees and shrubs from 612, the same references there, our general seeding calculator and our forestry tech note number 2. And we also have the opportunity with hedgerows to utilize some herbaceous plants within our hedgerow plantings, and those would relate back to 327 conservation cover. So it is an option out there for landowners. One nice thing to think about with our hedgerows and our windbreaks, especially our shrubby windbreaks, is the multiple benefits that come from those plantings, not just in the wind protection or the pollinators, but in the case where we did the windbreak on the cut flower operation, they were interested in utilizing woody twigs and flowers from that windbreak in their operation. And so the multiple benefits on that farm to utilize, whether it be the stems of red osier dogwood or elderberry or some other plant, it gave them another source of material for their operation. So don't forget those multiple benefits when you're planning these practices. With hedgerow planting, we don't have a whole lot of developed materials here, but you can see we need to follow the standard. And then when we're developing a plan for hedgerow planting, it's very similar to tree planting or windbreak, where we need to know the planting dates, site preparation, the species and spacing to be used, the planting methods, and then the post-planting maintenance, how we're going to maintain that planting over time. So a lot of similarities within our tree planting and our shrub planting practices. They do scale very well from large fields down to small urban or small farm situations. We haven't made a lot of changes to the implementation requirements because they do scale up and down fairly well. And if you have any questions or comments, we're happy to address those. And I just included a slide here with some references to that forestry technical note and the web soil survey and our general seeding calculator if you're trying to track down those species that are suitable. And that was all I had, Jennifer.
Well, I appreciate it, Dan. We did have at least one question pop up in the chat, and I'll encourage folks to type in more if you have additional questions, or raise your hand if you want to ask Dan a question directly. But we did have one come in from Jamie Schonkweiler, who asks, so say an applicant wanted more than 200 linear feet. Is it an issue to use the regular payment scenario in the same practice schedule where you are using the small farm scenario? She says, I'm mostly asking if that's a planning red flag.
I will answer that, and then Shannon can correct me if I get it wrong. I think that is okay. We talked about that with our tree planting scenarios. You might have somebody that wants to plant multiple acres of trees, and then they have a small section that they want to use the small farm scenario on. And I believe we said that it was okay, and I would think that would apply to windbreaks as well. But I'll let Shannon jump in here if I misspoke on that.
Yeah, let's make sure we're on the same page, Jamie. I'm thinking your question is there's 400 feet of windbreak needed. Can we pay 200 feet at the small scale and the rest 200 feet at the regular scale payment? And I'll point you back to I lost the bulletin number. Hold on one second. It's Indiana Bulletin 23-06, where we covered how to schedule the very small scale payments with the others. And so in other words, in that, if my situation that you're going with, you have 400 feet needed, that would not be appropriate. You would schedule the full 400 feet as the normal payment schedule, not combine those. So again, the reason for the small scale payments is the economies of scale. And so again, the farmers having to purchase small amounts, and that warrants the small scale payment. So yeah, so hopefully that makes sense. Yeah, so that's 180-23-06 was the bulletin that we sent that out, that guidance for. Good question, though. Very good question. Thank you.
Shannon, Jamie clarified
Nope, my bad.
that she means that if you're using 400 feet of the regular scenario, but small farm scenarios for mulching and things like that.
Oh, definitely. Definitely.
Cool. Thank you for clarifying, Jamie, and thank you, Bree, for jumping on that one. Bree also typed into the chat about work that they're doing with the pollinator partnership on developing a tech note for 422 hedgerow for these small farm settings. So that will be, I'm sure, useful as well. So thank you. Any other comments or questions before we take a quick stretch break? All right, I am not seeing any, but please, by all means, feel free to add them into the chat and we can revisit them when we come back, if that's the case. But at this time, we'll go ahead and take a break, like I said, 10 minutes, and then we'll come back to hear about the compost calculator from Kevin Allison. So 10 minutes and we'll meet back up. Alrighty, folks, the 10-minute timer went off, which means we are coming back from break. Hopefully we got a chance to, again, get up and stretch, get something to drink, get some fresh air, and be ready to come back into the next segment of our session today. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Kevin Allison, who's going to share the compost calculator with us. Kevin, are you on and ready?
Yes, thank you, Jennifer. Okay, I'm going to share my screen here real quick. You see a picture, everybody?
We see your non-presentation slides right now, or your, index on the left and your PowerPoint menus up there at the top.
Okay.
Looks great.
In 1 second, sorry.
Nope, no problem.
Try sharing that a different way to make sure it's.
It did come up there briefly there at the end.
Okay, I'll just be patient. Okay, it probably is on its way. So what you're going to see, if you're not seeing it already, is maybe let me know if you can you see that, Jennifer?
Now it looks great. Yep. Go ahead.
Okay, great. All right, cool. So this is just wanted to introduce this topic about compost with a scenario from the field, like what you'd see. In this case, it's my garden. You can see some cereal rye going on the right, but mainly focused with this middle bed that's in an oats and peas cover crop that has winter killed. So you can see it's dead. This was, I don't know, 4 weeks ago, maybe. The next picture a few days ago. So started raking the oat mulch off the bed and into the pathway. You can see a little weed pressure there, not too bad though. So the next step was to stirrup hoe or hand weed. I stirrup hoe just lightly spot weeded the spots that did have weeds and got those off the bed. So just clean it up to have no more weeds. Most growers, or a lot of growers that would be planting carrots, like to broad fork just to loosen up the soil a little bit. It makes harvesting easier later on as well. So I did that with the pitchfork. Kind of, we showed that in 201, but just kind of rocking it back a little bit just to crack the soil just a little bit to get some airflow and decrease compaction. And then this is what the soil looked like. So this has been in a soil health system for 5 years, but just pretty much one day after raking out off the oats, off the top of the bed, we lost our soil coverage and protection. So now we've got a bare bed. And that was going to dry out really fast within a day. The top maybe ½ inch was getting dry. And, once we have like dry bare beds, we start losing soil life and soil health. So that being said, I'm planting carrots to this bed. So I can't necessarily just put a bunch of straw on it because I've got to get a seeder through there. And it's got also, the carrots just don't like competition. So they've got to have room to grow. They can't be working their way up through wood chips or a big pile of leaves. So the next step on this bed was to sprinkle out some feather meal as a nitrogen starter fertilizer. So that got spread on the bed. And then here's what we're here to talk about is compost. So I got about five gallon buckets of compost, spread it over the bed. And my goal here was to just cover the soil as much as I could without using too much. Some growers would put on 4 inches. I think what you see here is probably like what relates to like a ½ inch. But most folks' goal is like a weed suppressing mulch. So they won't have to come back and like stirrup hoe throughout the season or spot weed as their carrots grow. I didn't use 4 inches, agronomic reasons and also just supply reasons, but just wanted to get something on the soil surface to get it covered. And granted, this will decompose, but hopefully by the time this is starting to decompose and leaving a bare bed, the carrots have come up and created a canopy to shade it out. So this is, I guess, just wanted to show like a good reason why folks are using as much compost as they do. A lot of it is kind of soil health based. So there's the small carrot seeds. That's the row seeder, the earthway seeder, creating furrows. You can get pelleted carrot seeds and have that earthway seeder actually drop the seeds in. In this case, I actually just created the furrows and then hand seeded it. and then packed it in with my hand. Again, that row seeder could have done it itself. So yeah, carrots are planted, got good moisture. It's conserving the moisture in the bed. And then this is a little bit of extra, but that's a white tarp or one of the silage tarps, white side up. And the idea with there was just to hold moisture in. I don't want to be out there watering today because I've got to give a 401 presentation to the INNRCS. So that white tarp up, white tarp up is just kind of conserving moisture. That carrot will probably germinate in a week or so, and I'll take that tarp off like before it really sprouts or sprouts at all. It's just so it's just a placeholder to conserve moisture. So just want to show you that compost can be important on these farms. The analysis from that compost I used, it was actually just shredded leaves. It was probably like 2-year-old pile when I got it. Turned it a few times in the last year since I did have it, so it's broken down a little bit more fine. So this is just the common reading that you might see. So pH is high on this one, 7.9. Some of these, like depending on the compost source, these will be variable, of course. But I do see a lot of high pH in mulches in compost, so maybe just an FYI. The organic matter content is like 60% dry rate basis, and the carbon and nitrogen ratio is like 30-1. So if you had more manure in this, it would probably be more like a 15-1 because it's more nitrogen heavy. Or maybe if they use like food produce or more greens than browns in their compost mix, you would probably get more of a digested lower carbon and nitrogen ratio. The next page of a normal compost analysis might show specific nutrients and their percentage in that pile. So, or in that, percentage of the material. So if you look at nitrogen, the dry rate basis is 0.98. So, that's less than 1% of the pile being nitrogen, or of the compost being nitrogen. Phosphate, P2O5, 0.32, a fraction of a percent. But it's kind of incredible, as you'll see through the calculator, how much, when you're putting on a 1/2 inch or you're putting on 2 inches of compost, how quickly that can build up and how much actual nutrient content that actually is, despite it being a low result. So this is just we'll plug in those numbers in the calculator, but I did want to show you this. I've been having some great conversations with Purdue University professors about plant available nutrients. And I think this calculator will be able to be a tool that growers and planters can use to know, or at least guess what, how much plant nutrients you might be getting from compost when applied. But I think there needs to be some fine tuning and some more research, and just we want to be sure that we're giving accurate nutrient. We're wanting to be sure we're capturing everything correctly. But at any rate, this is just a summary. So this says if the percentage of the nitrogen of the compost is over 2%, then usually 10% of that nitrogen will be available to the crop in that first year. And you can see that if it's a lower percentage of nitrogen, so the one I showed you was 0.98. It's mostly leaf compost, not a lot of nitrogen, it's not manure, it's not really nitrogen heavy. So we wouldn't actually much expect any nitrogen contribution to that crop in that year. And that's also assuming it's incorporated. So you'll notice that I just put mine on top. These estimates are more for if you were to till in that compost 4 inches or 5 inches. I'm not sure a whole lot of research has been done on nitrogen availability if it's just top dressed. So again, lots to learn. The potassium, it's a little bit more, what do you say, not loose, mobile, I guess. And so there will be potentially 90% of that compost available, of 9% of the potassium available in that first year. And then phosphorus, again, don't take these for word for word. These are more just a summary and more research to come, but in general, 75 to 80% of phosphorus might be available. And another source said, 60% in year 1, 20% in year 2, 10% in year 3. Okay, so let me show you the calculator. Quick second. Okay, can you see that okay?
I can.
Okay, So this is the compost calculator, and it's pretty much like almost like a record sheet for a producer to kind of remember, you know, or to understand their compost. So let's just say my name is Kevin Allison. This was 2-year shredded leaves. It was a mulch landscaping company, and I think it was like 2021 that I got that result. No, it didn't actually. Interesting. All right. At any rate, okay. So there's a really important metric in here. So the weight per cubic foot of the compost is a needed variable. Like we need that to be able to calculate if we want to do anything in like pounds per acre or pounds per square foot. Like you need to convert from volume to weight. You're going to need a standard for how much this compost weighs. So I'm going to go down to sheet 2 real quick. Down here, and I think we're going to try to build this in so you don't even have to go to sheet 2 to figure this out, but at the very top it has common weights of compost. So in general, like a leaf compost would be about 40 pounds per cubic foot, and a composted manure would be a little bit heavier at 50 pounds. So granted, of course, like if it's wet and there's all sorts of variables, but I think that's a pretty good common cue to go with would be to like 40 or 50. So in this case, it was 40 pounds because I was using leaf compost. So here's where I can start doing my records. So it was 60% organic matter, 7.9 pH. That was carbon nitrogen of 3. It's got to fix that, but it was 30:1. The nitrogen was just 0.98. Potassium, P2O5, 0.66. 0.60 on magnesium, 2.99 on calcium, and 0.29% on sulfur. So once we get some of that research and more understanding of percent available in a year, like you could say, okay, let's there's going to be 5% of that nitrogen available in that first year. I think the potassium, they assumed like 90. Let's assume 80% for P2O5. Okay, so that's like in a given year. So now the cool part of the calculator is that, well, let me just keep going. Okay, so it's got four different kinds of calculations, and it kind of depends on your input. Well, it does depend on what input you know. So you're always going to know the area, right? So mine was 75 square feet, and the depth, in this case, I think I did a 1/2 inch, assumed a 1/2 inch. So this calculator here is just for when you know the depth of compost. A lot of growers think that way. You know, I'm going to put 2 inches down, I'm going to put 3 inches down, I'll put 1/2 inch down. So from there, it's going to tell you all the other variables. So that should be over that 75 square foot area. That should be 3.1 cubic feet. It should be 0.1 cubic yards. Tons per acre is 36. The pounds per area is 125 pounds per area. And it's, 0.5 inches. It then takes the data from that nutrient analysis and it converts it into pounds per acre for that area. So if I'm putting on a 1/2 inch of compost over that 75 square feet, then there's about 232 pounds of phosphorus in that bed or in that area that I'm putting on that area, which is high, right? It gets up fast. So like, if you're doing it agronomically according to nitrogen, so you're trying to supply nitrogen with compost, you might be able to get to your nitrogen eventually, but you're going to put on a huge, and maybe over apply phosphorus and potassium. So I think that's where this calculators can be important in helping growers think through that. So just to continue on, if you knew the area, let's say it's 250 square feet, and you knew the cubic feet that you're putting on, so I'm putting on 5 cubic feet, let's say, it's going to do the same thing. It's going to kick out the other variables and then tell you the pounds per acre of each nutrient. Same thing with cubic yards, same thing with tons per area. Let's say it's 1,000 square feet. And let's say an agronomist told this person to put on 2 tons per acre of a certain of compost. Then they would know that it's, very, very shallow. That's not much. That's just a shallow kind of dusting. But they do have like the amount of yards or cubic feet that they would need to put over that area to achieve that. So that's the calculations in a nutshell. On the second page, there are reference tables. So this, some people don't have an analysis. I would definitely encourage to get an analysis before using this tool, because granted, like we do have some common NPK analysis of certain materials, but those can vary so widely that it's probably just better to get a test. However, you could use these. And then, there's just common things that you would need to, or potentially a grower might use when they're using this calculator. So for example, I know I did 25 gallon, five gallon buckets. I did 25 gallons. So that's actually 3.34 cubic feet. So I could come back up and say, okay, actually it was, it was 3.3 cubic feet over 75 square feet. So that was actually what I put on. So I put on, probably a lot more phosphorus than I should have, but I really wanted, So I guess that's the conundrum, but like, at any rate, that's what the calculator does. And if you got any questions, let me know. Thank you.
Appreciate that, Kevin. And again, as Kevin noted, if you have any questions you'd like to ask about the compost calculator, please raise your hand or type it in the chat. And give you just a second or two to type or raise. And as you're thinking, I did want to circle back. When we came back from lunch, Ellie had provided a bit of a clarification in the chat, and I just wanted to ask her to take a moment to speak to that before we move on to the next topic.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. I just wanted to circle back to that because the answer I had provided does have a caveat. So it is correct in the rotation from year one peppers going to radish cover crop and to collards. It is correct that that would not fulfill the 1 year wait initially because of brassica being the radish and brassica being the collards. However, because that is a cover crop that's making that be a different or the same family, then right now the guidance is to contact the state office because there might be an exception with that. However, when you check the reference materials that we're looking at, the reference is that there is a lot of disease issues, usually with that brassica back to back. And so that is where the final answer of no comes in, is because of the disease issues with that. However, let's say if you had oats and then corn, then that might be a yes, go ahead, even though it's the same plant family, then you can go ahead and plant it because there are no known disease issues that would come from that sequence. So wanted to provide that clarification, and hopefully, Becca, hopefully that was the example you were thinking about that kind of made you think. So thank you for that.
Appreciate that, Ellie. And before we switch topics, I did see a question come in from Rebecca, which I believe is directed to Kevin's content that he shared on the compost calculator. And Rebecca asks, does this work for other organic amendments like fish emulsion, and blood meal / feather meal?
This is probably more for like bulk materials, Becca. I think like, we're actually developing another tool that's pretty close to done. And you can kind of, you can put in the area that you want, and then the type of organic amendment like fish meal or blood meal, and you can really take a nutrient recommendation from pounds per acre down to ounces per square foot. But I think that's probably better served on that calculator that's upcoming. Good question.
Thanks, Kevin. Right, just checking to see if there's any other questions or comments, and I don't see any. So we will go ahead and keep moving. We have a couple more topics on the agenda before we take our last break before we close out for the day. The next session is Brianne Lowe is going to pop in and talk a little bit about wildlife tools. Brianne, are you ready?
Yes, Jennifer, I am on here, and I'm only going to be on here for a minute or so, so not going to take too much time in this section. But I wanted to take a moment to share the resources that are available Back in December, I had hosted 2 different webinars. They happened to be on the same day, but there were 2 webinars regarding the topic of wildlife habitat, particularly pollinator habitat in these small farm settings, and the tool we have now available for planting with plugs in these settings. So these are the opening slides for those 2, and there are some QR codes to access the YouTube version of those trainings, and I am putting the links to those trainings in the chat as well. So we're not going to cover those. Oh, sorry about that. Covered up the QR code for there. I'll put the other link in the chat here in a moment, but just wanted to make sure everyone was aware that these are out there, but we're not going to take any time today because we did cover these back in December. If you have any questions about these, and I've received a few plug questions from the field over the last couple of weeks, don't hesitate to reach out and we'll get those answered for you.
All right. Thanks, Bree, for putting out a plug for your plug calculator training. Sorry, I couldn't resist. Um, Again, as Bree mentioned, any questions, feel free to reach out. And certainly, I believe Bree's on today for the remainder of the session. So if there's any items that pop up in the chat, we can certainly circle back to those. With that, we'll move on to our next topic. And we're going to have Tyler Staggs join us. He's going to talk a little bit about Conservation Desktop and some products that are available in there, or tools and resources that are available in there to help when you're doing planning in some of these smaller areas. Tyler, are you ready?
I was trying to get my mute to unmute.
Your screen, yeah, your screen looks great.
Perfect. So urban and small farms, I guess, for the most part, by definition and location, are often at a smaller scale than many of our other practices and planning. So as such, we need to take some different considerations when planning and making conservation products at these different scales. So a couple of the topics I'm going to cover are base maps, like the NAEP versus world imagery, the use of the leaf off layer, and then location maps and the world transportation layer, and some of the few issues that can arise for that. So first thing is we need to activate our base map products. So first step is you click up here at the map tools and then select layer preferences. And then you go down and to the base map category, and you need to check these. But by checking these, that does not necessarily mean that they're active. That just means they're available. And then once you select the base maps that you want to use, then you can select the draw order in those, but it only allows you to select one. But it allows you to put things above other things. Base maps above other layers and such. And then to select your base map, you go to your map tools, you click over here to your base map gallery, and then you can select which one you want, whether that's NAEP, world imagery. I think those are typically the two used the most often. I don't know how you guys default. Mine, I've always defaulted to NAEP, but I do know quite a few people use the world imagery as well. So just remember, you got to go to your map tools, layer preferences to select them, and then you can go to layer preferences and the draw order, and then the 4 square box to select which base map you're going to use for your maps creation. That's on the far left. So these different base maps show different levels of detail at different scales. So here's a comparison of the NAEP imagery on the left and the world imagery on the right. Not a whole lot of difference at the 1 to 1,128 scale, but there is a bit of a difference. If you're planning on either, I think the details are close enough to being the same that what will show on one will show on the other. But if we zoom in one more layer to the 1 to 564, the at that scale, there is quite a bit of difference in the amount of detail they show. The NAPE still shows the image, and the world imagery will not display at that scale. So if you're wanting to plan, you want your conservation products, if the 1 to 564 scale shows what you need, you're going to have to use the NAPE imagery because the world imagery will not display at that scale. So just a couple things, just something to keep in mind as we continue to plan for these type of projects. The next one I would like to talk about is our leaf off layer. So if you go to your map tools, layer preferences, and scroll down to the imagery layer, you can use the Indiana best available leaf off. Now, of note that this is not a base map. This is a layer just like we have for hydrology, soils, any other type of layer. This will overlay on top of any of the base map and other data. So the one thing I caution you is I wouldn't use this as an actual default photo or visual because it takes longer to load. One thing too is oftentimes if we have issues with conservation products going to completion and actually producing the item we're trying to make, the state published layers, which this is, can cause a bit of a headache. So to get to this one, you go to your map tools, layer preferences, imagery, and then select the Indiana best available leaf off. Once that's done, to activate it, it's just like any other layer. You go up here to your map content, scroll down to where it's saved, and turn it on. So that's but as I said before, the state published layers can cause some issues. So if you are creating, let's say, plan maps and they're failing, maybe try turning it off and see if that's the issue. If you do, report this to the state office as soon as you can, and we can oftentimes get those worked out. So at the 1 to 564 different scale, you can see that the NAPE and the Indiana best available leaf off shows much greater detail. Plus the imagery of when the timing of when the imagery is flown. So when the time of the year that the picture is taken allows you to see things like under trees when they're not leafed out. So that can be very helpful in these small settings. And then as we zoom in to the next closer level of scale at the 1 to 282, you can really see a marked difference in the amount of detail being shown by the two different images. So if you're zooming into like a backyard or a small plot, you may keep in mind that the Indiana best available leaf off might be your best option for showing any actual details for location, especially if the lot or the tract has quite a few trees. So when we go to making our transportation maps, the world transportation layer will not display all the roads when zoomed out past 18,000. So oftentimes when we make our location maps, we make them at the 18,000 scale because it shows all the roads and intersections. However, that can cause just a little bit of problem because some of these tracks and fields are small enough that it's not readily apparent what we're trying to show the location of. So in this case, it's right above the laser pointer, just that little yellow square. So one thing to keep in mind is that at different scales, we can have not enough information visually, or we can have too much. So if you bring that into the 1 to 2,256 scale, you can see your project and you still have, you're still zoomed out enough to get multiple intersections to be able to locate the project. So just some things to keep in mind. Sometimes I know we kind of get into a routine of we click this, we click that, we click that, our map shows up. Well, in these cases, they're just enough different that we might want to double check the final products to see that they are showing what we're wanting to show. So one other thing is at these smaller scales, things are a little closer. One thing, as we all know, but just a reminder, we are not able to control the symbology of different practices. So depending on the type of practices you have planned and wanting to make maps, we may need to make multiple maps to show the detail we're looking at, because things are kind of truncated on these smaller scales versus say 180 or 100 acre field. The other thing I wanted to remind everybody is that the urban and small scale specialty crop planning guide is located in the, a link to that is located in the FY Indiana Conservation Planning tool. It's one of the tabs at the end, and then you can select and bring that up, because that gives us the, so, you know, we always, we plan things to the 10th of an acre and we use normal rounding rules, but that guide there will cover most and any and all those definitions that we need to adhere to when planning for this, well, all projects, but it's specifically how it pertains to urban and small scale specialty crops. So a couple things, just remember to keep in mind your base maps that you're using. It may or may not show the detail you're needing to see. The Indiana best available leaf off is available if we need greater detail than the base maps, and that we transportation layers, the world transportation, different scales may be needed depending on the size and location. You know, if it's out in the country, you still might be able to use the 1 to 18,000 to be able to get enough major intersections in there. But if it's say downtown, you know, in Marion County or downtown Vanderburgh County, the detail might be so much that you can't really get a good idea of the nearest intersection. So that's just a couple of the things I wanted to cover for making conservation products. Any questions?
Anybody have any questions for Tyler? Certainly feel free to put them in the chat or raise your hand. And while you're thinking, if you do have any, I'll just take a moment just to give a shout out to Tyler. Thanks so much for presenting on this stuff and for all that you've been doing for Indiana over the last several months. So really appreciate that.
No worries. It was fun.
Excellent. Just a comment from Daniel saying very helpful information. Thank you. I will second that. All right, well, if there are no further questions on that topic, we do have scheduled in another short break just to, again, get up and stretch as the afternoon goes on. And then we have just a couple more topics to discuss before we close out today's session. So with that, I am going to go ahead and set us up for a very quick break. We're just going to take 5 minutes and then we'll regroup and talk environmental evaluation. All right, back from our real quick break and ready to present on the last two topics we have. We have a topic and then we have our closing items we wanted to hit on. So without further ado, we'll go ahead and turn it over to Stephen Ball and Brianne Lowe to talk environmental evaluation, aka the CPA 52.
Thanks, Jennifer. And I'm going to go ahead and kick us off before handing this over to Stephen. And we're going to close out with this really exciting topic we know everyone is super interested in hearing about. But it's really, this is just going to be a high level touch base on this. What I will do, hopefully when this presentation is done, is put some links to some longer presentations that Stephen and I have given over the past 2 or so years of different lengths, depending on your level of need for the CPA 52 and NEPA compliance. But we wanted to make sure everyone was aware that this applies in these settings just as much as they do in our very rural and remote settings as well. So we're going to dive in to what the CPA 52 and NEPA requires. And like I said, it's going to be pretty high cut. I can get my presentation to move. All right, so the NEPA, or the National Environmental Policy Act of 1969, was created a national policy to protect the environment. It was created by the Council of Environmental Quality and then later adopted by agency regulations so that each agency could determine how they were going to implement NEPA. So ultimately, this came about through all the environmental movement that took place in the late 60s and the 70s. Federal agencies are required to provide detailed statements of environmental impacts for all major federal actions that significantly affect the environment. And of course, we always sit there and go, well, what does that mean by federal actions? So we're going to do a little bit of a quiz here. So pop your answers in the chat on the next slide. Those of you who have taken this presentation before are probably familiar with this. So what are federal actions? Oh, the quiz is coming up next. Federal actions are anything that the federal government has control or responsibility for. So this really is sort of the financial investment, or we get to make the decision about what is or is not going to be done on a particular property. So those federal actions are really what NEPA applies to. And that is what we need to make sure we are addressing when we look at this environmental evaluation. So now let's get to the quiz. So from these, if you could type into the chat, which letters are actually federal actions? Which would count as federal actions where we need to take NEPA into consideration? Type those letters into the chat. Give you a few minutes for these. Of these, A through F, which of them are federal actions?
It's okay. You can
As you
take
say,
a guess.
Did I scare everybody? It's okay. You won't be graded. There we go. Okay. All right. Seeing a wide range. We seem solidly determined there with C, but we've got a wide range of others coming in. All right. Give you a few more seconds to think through your answers. All right. All but B and F. All right. So here are the final answers. So obviously things like us certifying our practices for a state program, that's a state program. That's not a federal action. That should be very clear. Things like HEL determinations and the determination of an FSA approved system, that's just a determination. We're just going out and determining what's going on out on site or what is there. We aren't actually making any call into what will be implemented and how we would pay for that. B is a little bit trickier because providing technical assistance, we're just giving advice. We're not necessarily telling the landowner what they have to do, and we're giving them alternatives they can do, but there's an asterisk on here, and the reason there's an asterisk on here is the next slide. And I highlighted this and actually changed this from the original quiz if you participated in our earlier trainings, because I could see this being something that we're going to tend to do more in these urban and small forest settings, is providing that technical assistance. And we need to clarify that although NEPA doesn't require non-federal actions to be addressed, our CPA52 does. So it includes TA and FA activities. It includes our programs, and we also use it for FSA's program with CRP. We may use it if we help with some other programs. So we need to be sure that when we're providing that technical assistance, it is important that we're completing the 52 and we're really giving special consideration to the environmental impacts of those special environmental concerns Stephen and I are going to go into more detail for. So I just wanted to differentiate between that distinction that yes, NEPA says federal action. No, we don't do this necessarily for a wetland determination, but as we're starting to provide alternatives, expressing how these alternatives are going to affect a resource concern, we also need to be looking at, hey, if we're proposing this alternative, here's the potential impacts to the special environmental concerns in your area as well. So just things to be sure to consider and that are a little bit unique to these settings. So with that, I am going to hand control over to Stephen Ball, and he's going to cover the first environmental concern we're going to talk about today, which is the cultural resource sites. Stephen?
Thank you, Bree. There was a question in the chat. Jennifer, do you want to address that?
If you're referring to Will Sparks,
Yes.
yeah, he had put in the chat, realistically, it would be anything with a contract, right? But FSA is the responsible agency for CRP, which is correct. And Brianne alluded to that on the last slide before she passed it over to you.
Okay. Can you see my screen all right?
Looks
Yes,
great.
we can.
Okay. Well, thank you, Brianne, and good afternoon, everyone. Our discussion of the environmental review process is really going to focus on the complexities of working in an urban environment. So not so much the small rural farms, which follow our typical review process, but municipalities, especially with a dense infrastructure. For small farms in a rural setting, you continue with the present process that we have, where you have the CRT button in INNRCS Pro. You run that, and again, to emphasize, run it as early as possible, because if you get positive hits, it necessitates consultation with external agencies or even modifications to the cons plan. And it's also required to fill out the CPA52. But working with an urban environment can really complicate the historical review. And two of the main factors are historic districts and National Historic Register structures and buildings. Historic districts are where you got an entire section of the city that has a special historic designation. This can provide tax benefits to the residents, but it can also limit what modifications you can make to the structure within the district. Just as an example, this is the Heron Morton Place Historic District in Indianapolis. It's comprised mostly of private residences that are in a Victorian style, but there is also an apartment building and a theater included. Now, within an historic district, not all structures are considered historically significant. And there are a variety of reasons why the structure itself is considered historically significant. The architectural style was the original reason why this historic district was established. But the apartment building, which is part of the historic district, the building itself is not considered particularly significant. The main significance of it is that T.C. Steele, who is a fairly well-known Hoosier artist, once had a studio there. So it got on the National Historic Register because T.C. Steele, a historic personage, had a studio there. The theater in question was founded by Booth Tarkington, who was a two-time winner of the Pulitzer Prize for Literature. So I just use this to illustrate the diversity of sites within an historic district. Some are included due to their architectural style and setting, others because they're associated with a famous person or event. And then there are just the isolated buildings that may be on the National Register of Historic Places. Now in Indiana, a good example is the Lincoln Boyhood Home or the Lanier Mansion down in Madison, Indiana, or the Madam C.J. Walker Building in Indianapolis. So if you're making modifications to the area around these buildings, we're required to initiate consultation with the Indiana Division of Historic Preservation and Archaeology, City Historian, County Historical Society, really a kind of a cast of thousands. But that is relatively straightforward. You know, you're working on a national register, a national register site, you're modifying the property, you can expect that you're gonna have to do some kind of review on it. But since these are extant standing structures, they're also subject to review for adverse visual effects. And this is where things get hairy. In plain language, what this means is that if you're modifying the view shed from a National Register site, and that modification is considered to diminish the setting of the historic structure or the property's integrity, then you're required to enter into consultation to mitigate any effect. What it means is you may be working in the yard of a 1970s split level ranch, but it is the view of that yard from the adjoining National Register historic property across the street that is being impacted. And that is what you really have to address for historical resources. Now, fortunately, there's now an app for that. About 3 months ago, the Indiana Division of Historic Preservation and Archaeology released the Indiana Historic Buildings, Bridges, and Cemeteries web app. And I put a link on screen, and also there's a link in the chat. And this is really an excellent new app. I mean, I got to hand it to them. They did a really good job. It's publicly available to anyone. It's not restricted to the INNRCS. All partners can access the information. And unlike the situation we have with prehistoric site locations, there's no restricted information in this. You can access all the background information that you need. Now, just as an example, zooming into Monroe County, Bloomington, Indiana, since I happen to be here at the moment, you can see over here the layered list I selected for. These layers are grayed out because you're at this scale, you can't see them. The only thing you can see really are county boundaries and large historic sites like over here, which the Wabash Erie Canal with the associated structures on it. As you zoom in, these particular layers will appear. Also, if you select over here, you can find a base map gallery of the various base maps that are available. It looks familiar because this is an Esri product, and it's working through INNRCS portal. Now this is the Bloomington West Side Historic District. It's shown in green. And so once you zoom in close enough, you'll see all the historic districts in your area highlighted in green. The gold stars within the district are the individual National Historic Register sites, and the triangles are cemeteries. Now you can see which layers I've selected on the right, and they're the ones that we really want to be focusing on. There's also, I mean, if you're a history nerd like me, I mean, you can select the county historic sites, at which point you'll have dozens, if not hundreds, of structures show up as a county historic site, because all it really takes is being older than 50 years to qualify as a county historic site. But within that, you also have things that are considered notable and outstanding. And it's kind of neat to go through and look at those kind of things. Well, for me at least. If you're interested in exploring the individual, oh, sorry, I just saw pop up.
Sorry, Stephen.
Yeah, if you're interested in exploring individual buildings or cemeteries within an historic district, first thing you do is you have to deselect the National Historic District. Because if you click on the polygon, it'll bring up a screen very similar to this, which will allow you to click for the report on the historical district as a whole. In this case, I've just selected a particular historic structure within the district. You can also do the same thing for the cemeteries that are that show up on the web app. And if you select for that report, you'll get connected to the DHPA database, the same one that I use to search whenever I do any kind of review on prehistoric or historic sites. These reports can be printed to PDF. On the left, you can see the report on the Bloomington West Side Historic District. That's actually 7 or 8 pages long. The same thing with this report over here on the individual structure, the Elias Abel home. So, as Brianne said, we're just doing a kind of a broad overview on this. I mean, we're going to follow this up with training as well. But, so when you're planning in an urban area, you run the CRTE tool on ArcGIS Pro as normal. That produces the CPA52 addendum report, and you follow the normal procedure. But then you consult this web app, and you address these 3 questions. You know, are you operating within an historic district? Are you working on or near a National Historic Register site? Is it visible from the project area? Are you within 100 feet of a cemetery? Because as all our planners know, if you are doing any kind of groundbreaking practice within 100 feet of a cemetery, you need to have an approved plan for that. If the answer to any of these questions is yes, you contact me. Send me an email me the CPA52 addendum report, along with the PDF reports produced by the IHBBC public app, and include that the practices that you have planned and the cons plan if you have one at the moment. And, you know, I would love to get these things before you have a cons plan. So that was a quick and dirty. Any questions?
As Stephen asked, anybody have any questions or comments that they would like to ask or share regarding the material that either Stephen or Brianne have presented? As I mentioned in the comments, I just appreciate you guys both talking about this. This is a item that we're familiar with in planning, but we're kind of looking at it through a new lens when we're talking about doing planning in some of these other settings. So appreciate that. And I see a pretty cool slide up, so I'm going to hush up and looks like maybe Brianne talk a little bit more. Brianne, did you have some comments you wanted to make regarding the Migratory Bird Treaty Act?
Oh, I've been talking and I'm on mute. It doesn't really help, does it? I was just saying I wanted to make sure we had plenty of time for questions, but I know Stephen might have to jump off here shortly. So if there's any that come up after he jumps off, we'll be sure to get those down and get those answered as soon as we can. So I'm going to go back into the special environmental concerns that I typically deal with. And when I was making this presentation, I really thought I'd be primarily focusing on the Endangered Species Act, but then a couple of scenarios that actually may be more problematic in terms of some of these urban settings came up. And so we're going to cover a couple slides here first, starting with the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. And this is an act that's been around since 1918, and the treaty itself, and it requires that, or prohibits the negative impact on any migratory bird. So you cannot possess the bird, harm the bird, have a feather, have a nest, disturb a nest. And so that's why we have this lovely picture of a Canada goose on here, because what's potentially likely to happen in some of these settings, whether it's a small farm in a rural area that might have a pond nearby or in these urban settings, is the lovely Canada goose that we are all so fond of, and their nest, which if you've ever walked by a Canada goose nest, they're pretty defensive of their nests. And this is just a friendly reminder as you are working with the participants, these nests are protected under the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. So you cannot chase the bird off the nest and get rid of the eggs. You cannot shake the eggs without a permit. You cannot harass these birds to abandon the nest. That is actually prohibited by law. And so as you're making plans and you see one of these hanging out in a garden bed, we need to go through the proper channels, contact the DNR if that's something that does need to be removed. They do issue permits along those lines, but I wanted to just reiterate that that is illegal, and these are probably something we could encounter in these settings. So, and if it's happy next to the pond, just leave it alone and keep your distance. So next is the Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act. And this act is similar to the Migratory Bird Act, but added extra protections for the eagle, obviously the bald eagle being the nation's symbol. And it is a criminal offense for a person to possess an eagle, hopefully nobody has an eagle, or any part, egg, or nest thereof. It's also illegal to harass eagles as well. So you cannot be underneath a nest if they come into an area, even on national or state parks. There may be a buffer put up around a nest to prevent disturbance from hikers underneath it. However, this is an example here from my hometown of Pittsburgh. This is a bald eagle nest in the city. It nests right on the water. They have a camera on it. The middle shot is the camera snapshot of it feeding its young just a few days ago. They're everywhere now, even in cities, even in urban centers. And the reality is, if you do happen to work with a producer that might be near a river or near an eagle nest that's near a body of water, it's important that you at least notify me, and we're going to work through a process and a questionnaire that's available through the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service that basically says if the eagle chose to nest near you and the disturbance that you are creating, then it's not an issue. That most of these bald eagles in urban centers are pretty used to noise, pretty used to people. Even in our rural areas, if they choose to nest near a farm ground and you're just going to keep farming it, that's not considered harassment of an eagle. It's when we maybe change that disturbance. Similar to the idea of changing a view shed. If we're changing the nature of the environment around the nest, then we might have to look at it a little more closely. But there is a terminology called similar scope and similar effect that basically says we're not changing up enough that should affect the eagle. They chose to be here. So this is just a reminder again, bald eagles are showing up in our urban centers. They're actually quite popular in urban centers and get a lot of PR. And we just need to work through the appropriate process and documentation to say that anything that we're doing isn't going to disturb the eagle. So hopefully we're good there. And if you ever get a chance to check out some of these eagle cams from around the country, it's always really fun to see what they bring. Sometimes a little frightening to see what they bring back to the nest, but it's still fun. And then finally, to the Endangered Species Act. So this is the most recent of the acts that I just talked about, a little more closely tied with the environmental movement that came in the 60s and 70s that I talked about with NEPA. This is for the protection of species that are under threat or imminent threat of potential extinction, and of course is intended to make sure that we don't do anything as a federal agency that is likely to push a species even closer to extinction. Now, for the most part in history, the endangered species that we're going to encounter have very specific habitat requirements. They're located in very specific geographic locations. So the areas which were likely to impact them, of course, are most often going to happen in our rural settings. That's where nature often is a little more common. It's where more pristine environmental sites are a little more likely to be available. but it's not necessarily fully the case anymore. So while I don't anticipate there's going to be many times that when we run the T&E and CR tool that Stephen mentioned that you're going to encounter an endangered species in an urban setting or even a suburban setting, it's possible. And so we want to make sure that tool is still run, and then we can work through whether or not we anticipate that there's an impact. And I'm here to help with that process depending on where you are. So I wanted to highlight those species you are most likely to encounter, particularly in urban settings. Again, that species list gets a little broader as we get more rural with some of the small farms that might be a little closer to natural areas, but focusing on 3 in particular. And we're going to start first with basically the least likely to occur to the most likely to encounter. And the first is the northern long-eared bat. This is a species that has been on the threatened list for several years. We're actually in the process of updating our guidance because effective March 31st, so just a little over a week ago, week and a half ago, this species went from threatened to an endangered species. It can be found roosting in buildings, potentially. So this is where it's a little different than our Indiana bat, which typically does not roost in buildings. So this is something that when we see roost records come up, or if you are working in maybe a more remote setting or a rural area and you've got an old barn, you know there's bats in there and we're going to be doing any kind of work that's going to disturb that barn, we are going to need to do a northern long-eared bat consultation. So it is different in that regard than the Indiana bat. So that's potentially something that may be encountered on these sites. The next one, and I'm going to go through a little more detailed slide, will be the rusty patch bumblebee. I'll show you where this is potentially located and in Indiana, and they happen to be in our urban centers for at least 2 of the 3 locations. And that one has been listed as endangered since 2017. And then the last one that we need to be aware of and taking into consideration is the monarch. The monarch is not currently listed as endangered, but it is a candidate species. So it was considered warranted for listing, but it was precluded because there were some other species like the long-eared bat that they needed to make some decisions for before they got to the monarch. So that listing decision is anticipated in next year in 2024. However, NRCS policy requires that we treat candidate species very similar to how we treat threatened and endangered species in our CPA52 process. So I bring that up because I can guarantee that there are monarch potentially on every single one of these farms that you're working with. So from the Indiana bat and northern long-eared bat perspective, we do have joint guidelines. I'm in the process right now of revising these to move the northern long-eared bat from threatened to endangered, and some minor changes that will come with that in terms of forest management, but also adding some of the language that we need to about buildings and just being aware of that potential concern. So otherwise, not a whole lot different than the Indiana bat in how we will handle forest situations, the removal of trees, the felling of trees, very similar dates. There's just a few locations in the state that smaller diameter trees are potentially impacted. But for those on the call that may not be familiar with the bat process, we've been dealing with Indiana bat as an endangered species here in Indiana since about the 1970s, I believe. The northern long-eared bat is new, as I said, as of a week and a half ago. And for our neighbors, or if you talk with others from states further west, they were not in the Indiana bat range. So the impacts on cutting trees and site prep and things like that are far more impactful for some of our surrounding states than they will be for us. Good news is for us, it's kind of business as we've been proceeding. The next one is the rusty patch bumblebee, as I said. This one is a bee that was wide ranging across the US for many, many years. I mean, it was one of the most widespread bees, and now it's only known from very few limited locations. If you're looking at this map on your screen, you're going, where in the world is this even showing? The US Fish and Wildlife's map wasn't very detailed, so I've highlighted the locations in the state where this is a high probability of occurring. Doesn't mean it's going to be in your project location. It means that if this shows up as a rusty patch high on the CPA52 tool, we're going to need to take steps and work with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to make sure that we are not going to have a negative impact on the species. It's something called may affect, but not likely to adversely affect. So you can see up near the Chicago region, there's 2 node populations. There's one on the north side of Indy. And the one I encounter the most as far as requests submitted in is the one that's near Shade State Park. So otherwise, there's no other high probability areas in the state. You may come into a low probability area, which may say this has been a historical area. We know that used to be here, but it's either been so long or the habitat's been altered so much in that area. We don't need to contact U.S. Fish and Wildlife in a low probability area. It's an area for consideration to build habitat and expand the potential and hopefully help the species recover, but it's not the same as the high priority areas. And then finally is the monarch. Again, the most ubiquitous of the species that I've listed here, guaranteed to occur just about anywhere in the state, urban, suburban, rural, on an apartment balcony, in your grandmother's garden in the backyard. This insect is everywhere. And because that it is a candidate species, INNRCS policy does require that all the potential impacts of federal action still be evaluated and minimized when practicable. But the alternatives with adverse impacts at this time don't tell us that we can't provide assistance. They do not preclude our assistance. Until it gets moved to something like proposed, then we'll have to take a different consideration. Because it's candidate, we just need to make sure we're offering all the alternatives possible that are likely to have no impact on the species, certainly no adverse impact on the species. And to help with this, the CPA52 tool has a decision document built into it. It walks you through step by step of asking questions about what type of practices you're going to implement, what's the current site conditions, and is there likely to be an adverse effect. So this will step you through, and our Indiana CPA52 tool is built in with a little drop-down box that specifically addresses the monarch, where you can select from the options over on the far right in that highlighted box there. You can pick no habitat present, no adverse effect based on the decisions you make from the questions above, down to may adversely affect. There's no practical alternative. And even if there is no alternative at this point, that doesn't necessarily stop us from continuing on. So if we have to rip out a patch of milkweed, that would be ideal that we wouldn't do that at this time. Certainly not during the summer months when there may be a caterpillar on that, but if there's just no way around it, if we cannot wait till the fall, we cannot choose to remove that habitat at a time of year when the monarch will not be around. At this point in time, there's nothing that stops us from moving forward. Might change in the future, but that's where we are now. And those are how the questions are basic. Those are the questions stepping you through that process to make that determination. So with that, I'm going to open it up for questions. There are additional trainings out there. I put the links in the chat for the environmental trainings. We have done some other weekly program meetings on the monarch. So again, if we need to do a more thorough look at why the monarch is listed and how we address it, we can do that as well. But just some ideas of what you may encounter while working on these particular farms.
Appreciate that information, Brianne. Sounds like you are looking at the chat as well, but I will go ahead and just kind of make another call for both Stephen and Brianne. If there's any other questions or comments that folks would like to share, certainly feel free to put it in the chat or raise your hand and take yourself off of mute. All right, well, I'm not seeing any, but again, if you do have something come up here, please feel free to go ahead and type it in and we'll certainly circle back to it. But if there isn't anything else coming in question wise, we can work to close out the session. So with that, I'll turn it over to Shannon for our closing.
All right, thank you, Jennifer, and thank you everybody for presenting and listening and interacting. Just want to summarize some things here real quick. And we do have a survey we'd like you to take, so bear with me. Again, just in summary, this is all about conservation planning, right? I mean, we talk a lot about programs, and that's extremely important, but it's that technical assistance, that conservation planning that we provide to these clients that's going to get us more conservation on the ground than any program ever will. As well as, you know, all those program decisions fall right back into our conservation planning decisions. So we just have to remember that, keep that in the forefront, and we're going to be doing just great work out there. Remember, there is no definition for urban or small farm or small farmer or small scale. We can find these anywhere throughout Indiana. The need for this good conservation planning, this good technical assistance in our programs. So again, this impacts everybody on this call, not just those DCs and in Indy and Bloomington and the region, and all those other great urbanized areas. So as you know, our FY23, we had a lot of brand new opportunities for these small scale farmers. We hopefully gave you the information you need to be knowledgeable about them. We know there's going to be a lot more opportunities come up in FY24. So if you haven't had a chance to get out on some of these small farms yet and see how these conservation planning principles and programs fit, guarantee you'll have an opportunity in FY24, and we look forward to seeing your successes out there. Can't thank the training team enough. Everyone, please give a little clappy hand, chatty thing to show them your appreciation. It did take an army, and I think they did an outstanding job. I really appreciate their time and their dedication, their collaboration, making this an effective training for you all. Thank you, everybody. If anyone out there has this are interested in this and want to be join our team to help put these kind of trainings together, you notice a lot of names on here. They didn't speak, but they were very instrumental to getting that material and together, bouncing ideas, bouncing experiences off everybody, developing tools, testing the tools. So that's outstanding. Thank you. If this still appears, let's just say overwhelming. There we go. Do remember that we do have our urban soil health team as part of our contribution agreement with the Indiana Association of Soil and Water District. You definitely heard some of these folks talking today, and they were definitely instrumental in putting this material together for you. Just remember, if you have needs out there locally, you're not alone. Work together with your local partners, bring in new partners to the table, find out the best way to help your urban and small scale farmers and address their resource concerns. And Ellie and her team are available to assist those local partnerships to come together and have the great ideas to help these farmers out. You heard a lot of great information about some brand new tools. And again, I can't thank our partners enough for taking the leadership on many of these and putting these together. Where do you find them? Right now, they are on that urban soil health box site that we've shared through our Outlook invitations. And they will be posted to the Field Office Tech Guide soon. They are operational. They will get you a sound scientific answer. We're just kind of doing some little bells and whistles functionality programming to them now before we officially release them to the Tech Guide. But if you have any immediate needs, please reach out to your area office, reach out to the state office, reach out to your urban soil health team representatives, and we'll help those clients the best way we can. I think we have to all admit that we don't have all the answers. We know you don't have all the answers. We don't have all the answers. Nobody in the nation has all the answers. So we're working on a lot of these together, and we're going to learn together and along with our clients and help them out and learn and pass that knowledge on to the rest of us and make for an outstanding group of technical assistants out there. One topic I forgot to mention, that a lot of in the chat about micro irrigation and lifespan and all these things. So we did purposely not address those questions because, again, that's something that we need to kind of come back to the table as a state office and our partners and get you the answers you need. And some of those questions, I guess we can answer. Like, we've said some questions about water quality. Our 441 standard does require the water to be tested before run through a micro irrigation system. So we covered that back in our 201 training. We also do in our programs have groundwater testing. So again, we could help farmers pay for some of that water testing. And again, we went through the reasons for that in the 201 training. But there's other questions out there that we need to get answers for. Such as, can we install a brand new irrigation system for a small scale farm. You know, drilling a well, putting in a pumping plant, irrigation pipeline, irrigation, micro irrigation, so on and so forth. Those are some of the questions through our programs that we need to make sure we get you a sound answer. If you have that question now and you need an immediate answer, like I said before, please reach out to your state office folks, area office folks. We will get you an answer one-on-one. But right now, we need to have some more discussions before we send out that answer to the masses. Okay. For FY24, you'll definitely have it, but we want to make sure we have our conversations with our programs experts before we say something that's not quite 100% correct. Okay. Hopefully that works. But again, if you have those specific questions right now with a client that needs an answer, reach out to us. We will get you an answer. And if it changes next year, it changes next year. If not, we move forward. We learn together. Hopefully that appeases that amount of chat. I really appreciate that chat. But we will get you answers here in the near future for those. And finally, if you would, please scan this survey, QRL code, or you can click on the link there. I guess, Ellie, I assume you'll put that in the chat. And we would like your feedback on this and the answers to these questions. And with that, I will open it up for any other last-minute questions on any topic, including micro irrigation. Put them in the chat, raise your hand. If we have to punt on them, we definitely will. Otherwise, we'll answer.
Thanks, Ellie, for dropping that link in the chat for the survey. And again, as Shannon mentioned, you know, please do take the time to fill out the survey. Not too long, not too painful, but it's valuable feedback for the group. And then as well, as Shannon mentioned, any outstanding questions on any of the content that was presented today, or, you know, if there's other questions that you might have regarding this topic that may not have been directly hit today, certainly we encourage you to bring those up. As Shannon mentioned, we'll answer them if possible. If not, we'll certainly follow back up to get you that information. And Ellie just popped in the chat as well, just encouraging you all to keep letting us know your ideas for future functionality for the tools, what works, and what else will be helpful for you in your planning decisions. And I would extend that not only to the tools, but just additional training as well, or further, you know, any further clarification on things or topics that haven't been hit on with this series that you would like more information on. Please share that information.
All right, we'll see no further questions, huh, Jennifer?
I'm not seeing any. They're probably all busy taking that survey right now to get you that feedback.
Okay, I want to also extend a huge thank you to you all as participants. Your interactions and questions made it very enjoyable, very much better than just presenting to you. Hopefully you learned something, and I know we all learned something when we put these trainings together and deliver them too. So great questions. We really appreciate them, and we'll keep working on all this great stuff together. So with that, I will go ahead and stop the recording, and I wish you all a great rest of your day, and look forward to the next chance we get to meet and talk about the great conservation work you're doing. Thanks, everybody.